On their return, the apostles told Jesus all they had done. He took them with him and withdrew privately to a city called Bethsaida. When the crowds found out about it, they followed him, and he welcomed them and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed to be cured. The day was drawing to a close, and the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away so that they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside to lodge and get provisions, for we are here in a deserted place." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fishes, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Make them sit down in groups of about 50 each." They did so, and made them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and blessed and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate and were filled. What was left over was gathered up, 12 baskets of broken pieces.
The story of feeding our neighbors actually begins over 75 years ago in Finland with the Holmi family. And Reverend Holmi and his boys, his children, were at home, and the food had run out. He had been getting by with what they had for as long as he could, and the situation had become desperate. So Reverend Holmi and his boys were all in the kitchen praying, asking God for help, for guidance, for what to do next. Meanwhile, in another part of the village, one of their parishioners was thinking, "I wonder how the Holmi boys are doing. I haven't seen them in a while. I think I'll bring them some dinner." And she did. She came in the middle of their prayers, asking God for guidance, and there came dinner. One of those children grew up, and he also became a minister, and he and his wife relocated to California, where they made feeding others part of their ministry. And today, Miley Holmi is also feeding people. She is a professional chef, and she witnessed her grandmother and grandfather feeding probably thousands of people throughout their lives. And she remembers hearing the story of the neighbor who appeared one night with the miraculous dinner. That brings us to March of 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic and many people out of work, and especially people in the restaurant and hospitality industry. So Miley, being a chef and a caterer, had met many people in her work in the restaurant industry, and she was thinking about some specific people whom she knew. And she went to check on a family and found out that things were indeed bad. She remembered the neighbor who was thinking about those Holmi boys years ago, and she was thinking about the people she worked with, and she took it as a sign. And as she went from house to house of the people that she knew, she found out that many people were not eligible for government assistance, that the food banks at the time were not able to offer enough food to sustain families for a week. And so Miley took it upon herself to just go to the store, get some groceries, and bring it to those people in need. And that is how the Feeding Our Neighbors program began. All those years ago in Finland, with someone thinking about her neighbors. As I mentioned, Miley started feeding people that she came upon in her community up in the San Ynez Valley. And as friends of hers heard about what was going on, they contributed with money. They contributed with volunteering to repackage bulk beans and rice. They contributed by donating food. She even had some growers that she knew in Santa Maria who donated produce, and her program grew, and she was posting about it on Facebook. And so I said to Miley, "Oh, that's great work you're doing. What can I do to help?" I was hoping she would say I could give her, $20, maybe even $30. And she said, "Well, could you start this program in Santa Barbara? There's a lot of need there." And I thought, I can't start programs. I need to just support a program that already exists. And Miley explained, "Nope, that's not what I did. I saw there was a need. I went to the store, I got food, and I fed the people." And I think for the rest of my life, I'm going to remember that I don't need to wait for someone to start a program. That when I see a need and I have an idea on how to fill it, I just need to go fill that need. And that has been a profound lesson for me in this Feeding Our Neighbors program. And I am so grateful to Miley for being a role model in that. Instead of waiting for someone to point the way, she just made the way herself. So when I brought up the idea to Dana Monk, and said, "Why don't we go check out what they're doing in the Santa Ynez Valley?" She said, "Sure, let's do it. I know there's people who need food." And then I approached Scott Eschbach to find out about the rules of using Morgan Hall and things like this, and he was absolutely open to the idea and asked me questions, figured out what our needs were and how they would match the capacity of the hall and our social distancing and safety. And it all just flowed from there, with everyone being open-minded and willing to come together and to make this work. And it was truly a pleasure to be working with people who just want to make it happen.
The way I saw it got started is Ann Patton Rubin, who's a friend of mine, knew of a project in the valley, over in the Santa Ynez Valley, that was helping neighbors there with just straight food distribution. No questions asked, just feeding people who were out of work and in need of food. We went over there on a Thursday, and it was amazing. I couldn't stop smiling. It was like the biggest food giveaway, with volunteers, with donations, and everybody was happy and smiling. We came home that day and decided we needed to try something like that at St. Andrew's. I have a dear friend named Josefa Rios, who is the lead promotore of the Santa Barbara County Promotores Network. And that's an organization that trains volunteers. They're all over the county. They're trained volunteers who work at the food bank and the hospitals and anywhere they're needed as volunteers.
Another aspect of the Feeding Our Neighbors program that I will forever be grateful to is learning more about the Promotores Network of Santa Barbara County. Because I had met Josefa Rios through Dana, and actually Josefa has been active at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. She has attended the PW Christmas Tea, and she attended the mission trip into Chinle, Arizona. So I did know Josefa, and I did know that she was a lead promotora for Santa Barbara County. But I didn't know the full extent of the Promotores Network and the amazing work that they do. As Dana mentioned, the Promotores Network are volunteers, and they get trained, and then they go out into their neighborhoods or neighborhoods where help is needed, and they provide everything from teaching children how to brush their teeth to getting the right medical supplies to diabetics, and even, as with this program, getting them food that they so desperately need. And the Promotores volunteers were incredible. They were the first people to arrive, the last people to leave, and all I would have to do is say something like, "There are the eggs," and they were off and running and working, always with a great attitude, always with a smile. And I was very impressed and honored to meet all of these women and men and find out about all the work that they do providing health care to people in Santa Barbara County.
So Ann, Josefa, and I sat down on Sunday and decided we need to try this here because we had so many families in need. We got together on the next Friday with donations from farmers over in the valley from a few different places, and we put together 25 boxes of food to be delivered just to see how it would work. With that, it grew to the following week. We decided to set it up as a drive-through so that because of the pandemic that's going on, there would be very little hand touchings of things. People wouldn't touch the product. We had control, and so we loaded the food into the cars. That first week, we got somewhere around 190 cars. The first hour or so, Ann and I looked at each other and thought, nobody's gonna come. How do they know we're here? It's just word of mouth. No one will ever know. Then cars started coming. I looked at her and said, God's gonna provide. We don't have to worry about it. Everything will be fine. And God provided. Like I said, we had more than 190 cars that day. We fed upwards of 200 people that day. It's a week's worth of groceries for a family of 4 is how it's figured. So some weeks there was chicken, some weeks there was milk products, always fruits, always vegetables, always beans and rice, something that would be nourishing family meals. And that first week, I just kept smiling. Volunteers came around. I had made some initial calls into the congregation asking for help. And word of mouth, the promotores got involved. We had somewhere around 30 volunteers that first week.
The very first week that we did it, there were some traffic problems down on Ahe and Arroyo. And Suzanne Malloy brought this to my attention, and to my shame, I somewhat ignored it, thinking, oh, what's the big deal? People can wait in a little bit of traffic for a good cause. But Suzanne knew better, and she persisted, and she brought all of her talents as someone who has worked with Red Cross and been trained in things like this. And she organized an amazing team of volunteers, and she got Linda Sorensen involved, and they got vests and cones and all of these things that I never would have thought about. Just going to prove it really takes a village. You can't just have one person with a good idea. You need other people with their good ideas to make it all happen.
The following week, we served almost 300 people. We still deliver. The promotores took on the job of delivering to people who didn't have cars. Somehow the Braille Institute got involved and sent my friend Josefa a list of names that people were in desperate need. So we were serving about 20 people from the Braille Institute. We had just this amazing experience of farmers donating and people donating and money coming in. God provided on such a scale, it was amazing to see. Every week it got more people, more cars. I think that third week we had somewhere around 50 volunteers in a week, just from word of mouth, just from people wanting to pitch in and help. And so we got it down to a science. Wednesday morning, we packed up beans and rice out of 50-pound bags and put them into 6-cup increments and got everything ready so that Friday morning we would hit the ground running, set up tents, and set it all up. And from 2 to 4, we had it down. Each station gave food away. It was amazing to see.
One of my favorite things about working in the Feeding Our Neighbors program is the diversity of people that were involved, the people I got to meet and to learn from and to be humbled by. Our group, although we were started at St. Andrews, we had an extremely diverse group. We had people from St. Andrews Presbyterian Church, from the Living Faith Center, from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I had a volunteer who describes herself as a possibilitarian, although mostly she's an atheist. Friends who are Jewish, friends who have left the church, friends who speak English as a native language, friends who speak Spanish as a native language. I think the youngest volunteers were 6 years old, and I couldn't begin to guess the upper ages of our other volunteers. But it was a wonderful, wonderful spread, and each person brought his or her own unique talents and gifts to the program.
I'd like to tell you a little bit about our volunteers. It started with some text messaging to some of our congregation, who then stepped up. It started with Suzanne Malloy in our congregation getting in touch with the 2 local churches that were nearby us, the Living Faith Center and the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And it started with the Promotores, who are a volunteer organization. And with those few bits of information, that volunteer force grew into probably 8 or 10 people working traffic control, because we had upwards of 200 cars coming through our parking lot, down the city street, and around. And Living Faith Center stepped up, and they allowed us to wrap around their parking lot. Their youth group, their minister, they were there every week. The Seventh-day Adventist Church opened their parking lot to all the volunteers so we would have somewhere to put our cars. And some of their members came and helped out and pitched in. In our congregation alone, there was probably a good 30 or 40 people who had pitched in at some point. And the cool thing was, it was parents and their kids. We had, not small kids, because it would have been a little bit difficult, but teenagers. The teenagers in our church came with their parents. Diane and Abby Weber came every week for a few weeks. Diana Lee and her daughter Allie came at the end and helped us when we really needed it. Nancy Russo from our church has a son named Sean who's 20. He came and helped us out the heavy parts to lift things. It was so wonderful to see these kids who grew up in our church. John Gonzalez helped out. Maggie Canas helped out with her mom, Robin. It was so nice to see these kids who grew up in our church to pitch into something that really meant something to the community, and they did it joyfully. Suzanne Malloy got all of the traffic organized so that we had cones and we looked like Disneyland cars coming in, and really stepped up getting volunteers to help us with all the traffic control. On Wednesdays, we had a group of people who couldn't help on Fridays or didn't feel comfortable in such a large group. John and Nancy Donor, God bless them, came every Wednesday morning, and she could tell you how many 100 pounds of beans and rice they repackaged. Barbara Eckspach, her husband Scott would come on Fridays with traffic. It was such an amazing time. They jokingly called me the volunteer coordinator because I got to know most of them. But to me, that was the best, because everybody was so happy to pitch in, help out, and keep going for such an amazing cause.
The youth from the Living Faith Center were helping us with parking control, and in fact, loaning us their parking lot as a place for an overflow line of traffic to wait. And these young women said, we're going to make inspirational signs. And so the next week they showed up and they had poster boards with signs saying things like, everything's going to be all right, God loves you. And I was so moved once again because I never thought of doing something like that. But these girls were bringing their gifts to this program and inspiring people in their special way.
We have had the privilege of working alongside and assisting your guys' mission and vision for all these cars that are parked in line right there that you guys have been giving food to. For the last 6 weeks, we've been blessed to be able to do it. And I have to say it's been a blessing in a sense that I've been in this church 30 years, and this is probably one of the first times that we've been able to connect as a neighborhood with the church, and we want to continue to do so. So I'm just going to go down the line, and just some of our youth, there are probably a total of 15 that helped out over the last 6 weeks, but I'm just going to let these guys introduce themselves. So here we go.
Nino.
Hey, Nino.
I'm Faz.
Silas.
I'm True.
True.
I'm Karina.
Karina.
Hi, I'm Braden.
And Braden. I think Braden was there from the beginning. I'll walk down a little bit further and get a couple of the adults that are helping.
Hi guys, I'm Jaylyn. I just wanted to thank you for letting us partner with you and do this over the last 6 weeks. We look forward to the next thing that we get to do with you.
Hi, and I'm Mandy, and I am so thankful that we were able to team with you guys and bless our community. We hope to do more things with you guys in the future. It was such an awesome time to be able to love on our community together.
It was such a blessing to meet so many people and realize that we are all part of God's world.
So my job, Fridays from 2 to 4, was to count the cars. I physically sat there and counted every car that came through, every family that came through, so that we would have an idea of how many we were serving, and it would help us know how many we needed for the next week. The upside of that, and the best part of that, was getting to know some of the families by eyesight. I didn't know who they were. We didn't ask names because it's none of my business. If you say you're hungry, we would feed you. But by sight, I got to know the cars. I got to know the kids in the cars. They got to know me. I'd see these little hands pop up in the back seat, or people brought their dogs, and everybody got excited to see dogs. And we were doing this during one of the graduation weeks. So some of the cars had happy graduation, whoever, to whatever high school or whatever school. One car pulled up, and it was a preschooler graduating, and it was all over the car, happy graduation. So I yelled to all the volunteers, and we all screamed for this kid, and it was so exciting. There were kids that they were so happy to see us. In fact, the last day, we got a thank you note from one of the kids. Just thank you. They were so grateful. And getting to know the people in the cars, getting to know them from our community, not knowing who they were really, but just on a human level, we got to know these people. And I think that was my favorite part. I just sat there, waved, said God bless you, and greeted them to our church, because that's how I felt. I felt I was really welcoming them to our church. And our church was feeding our neighbors, and so it worked out really well.
As you may have heard or seen, we had a very active car distribution line going for our Feeding the Neighbors program, where cars would drive up and stop at the different food stations, and volunteers with their masks and gloves would hand the food into the car or place it into the trunk for people. And one volunteer before this was starting said to me, well, how are we going to keep track? Are we going to ask people what their situation is? Why do they need this food? Are we going to ask them to sign up, to register, to show some proof or any of this? And Dana and I looked at each other and said, no. If God is putting someone in our parking lot willing to wait 2 hours in a hot car for our food program to open, then that person needs that food. And it is not for us to question why or how or anything like that. Similarly, some of the cars that came through the line looked like they might be expensive cars or might have been expensive cars at one time. There was one woman who came and she had a lovely old yellow Porsche. And upon closer inspection, it looked like maybe she lived out of that car. And then there were other cars that looked nice, and then we come to realize that they had livery license plates, and realized that the driver, that was his only way of making a living. And with people being afraid to go out, people sheltering in place, people not getting into small spaces like a car with strangers, all of the income had dried up. And my point to all of this is that it is not for us to judge who might be in need or what people's situations are. We just don't know. And it's not our job to question. If God brings them to us and says, here they are, feed my people, then that is what we do.
It was awesome to see how grateful these people were, how in need they were. I couldn't get over how wonderful it felt by the end of the day, being completely exhausted, but my heart was so full because everybody was so grateful. The volunteers were grateful. When this ended last week, I got texts from some of the volunteers that I had recruited thanking me for allowing them to be in our food distribution.